To face the necrons in battle is to stand against death incarnate. It is to know the terror of annihilation at the hands of beings who should be long rotted in their graves. The necrons' enemies see implacable android revenants rise from their crypts or step from amidst flickering witch lights to destroy all before them. In return, the necrons see only vermin, interlopers, and savages that must be eradicated in order for their mighty dynasties of old to rise again. Once, 60 million years ago, the Necrons' armies might have achieved their galactic conquest with singular efficiency. Yet, aeons of slumber and cold stasis have seen madness creep into the minds of their noble masters, as the stately dance of the stars themselves has scattered and ravaged their worlds. What arises now to reclaim the galaxy is an altogether more twisted race, scattered, factionalized, and riven by an insanity that has transformed many of their number into walking nightmares. The Necrons of the 41st millennium are a dark reflection of their faded glories. Yet, they are no less deadly for all this. In monstrosity and madness, the Necrons are rendered more terrible than ever before. In search of immortality, the Necrons are feared across the Imperium and beyond as a race of seemingly immortal android warriors. Dark rumors circulate of ancient tomb complexes rising from beneath the surfaces of settled worlds, of ominous invasion fleets sweeping down from on high, and of inexorable armies crushing all beneath their metallic tread. Yet, the Necrons were not always thus. Most of the galaxy's sentient races know the Necrons only as the terrifying beings they are now. Indeed, it took the Imperium of mankind many centuries to even recognize them as a coherent Xenos race. The Necrons' ruling nobility were clearly seen to be sentient and ferociously intelligent. However, few amongst them had made any efforts to elaborate upon their origins or motivations to what they consider to be the lesser races. They have simply exterminated them. Yet hints exist even now, in deeply buried xenoarchaeological remnants, in the long memories and hidden lore of the Eldari, and in commonalities of primitive artwork and tribal mythologies, of a race very different to the Necrons known and feared in the 41st millennium. Once, the legends suggest, the Necrons were a flesh and blood race known as the Necrontyr. Short-lived and warlike, these beings were obsessed with death, and, for all their wondrous technologies and star-spanning empire, were in fact quarrelsome and fractious. Legends tell that, desperate to unite their people, the Necrons' rulers began a war with the beings known as the Old Ones. It was a war over the secrets of immortality. and also a war that the Necrontyr could never win. If cogent details of this war in heaven still exist, they do so only in the memories of the necrons themselves. However, Eldari lore suggests that the Old Ones were the creators of the Webway, the arterial network of ethereal tunnels that still spans the interstices between the warp and real space. Using the Webway, the Old Ones drove the Necrontyr back on every front. It was in the Necrontyr's darkest hour, during the reign of Zarek, last of the Silent Kings, that the Catan, those called the Yingir, came before the Necrontyr with an offer of aid. The legends speak of ancient star gods, beings formed from the fundamental energies of the universe, who offered Zarek and his people all they had ever desired: power and immortality. All it would cost was for the Necrontyr to ally themselves with the Catan to destroy the hated Old Ones forever. Zarek deliberated long, but in the end he accepted the offer. In doing so, he damned his entire race. Fragments of lore describe what followed. The nightmare process of biotransference that placed the minds of the Necrontyr into living metal bodies and transformed them into the necrons. The price was their souls, devoured by the leering Catan, and, for all those but the ruling castes, the obliteration of almost all personality and free will. No more would the Necrons war and politic with one another, for their wills were bound to Zarek's control through cast iron command protocols. Yet the cost of this unity had been monstrous indeed. The legends continue, scattered fragments telling of the defeat of the Old Ones and of how, in the moment when the Catan were at their weakest following the Titanic conflict, the Necrons took their revenge and shattered the duplicitous star gods. They describe how Zarek saw that his people's time was done, for they could not face the Old Ones' vengeful servants, the Eldari chief amongst them. It is said that the Silent King commanded his people to inter themselves within the stasis crypts of their tomb cities, there to sleep out the aeons until they could rise again to conquer all. Finally, destroying his command protocols and freeing his race, Zarek took his ship into the intergalactic void to seek whatever solace he might amongst the empty darkness. The Necrons have slept for 60 million years, if the Eldari Book of Mournful Night is to be believed. Now they are waking at last, rising up to take back what was once theirs, and the galaxy trembles before them. The technologies that facilitated the Great Sleep were so far beyond human comprehension that they might as well have been sorcery. Hyper-intelligent master programs and legions of canoptic slave constructs watched over the Necron tombs as the ages crept past. Despite all this, manifold disasters beset the slumbering Xenos. Some tomb worlds were plundered by lesser races, or purposely purged by vengeful Eldari. Others faced cascaded failures in their stasis crypts, were obliterated by stellar catastrophe or comet strike, or endured such violent tectonic shifts that entire tombs were flooded with molten lava. Even those worlds that survived ended up far from their original positions, scattering the dynastic territories of old and leaving the necrons fragmented and factionalized. The chronostats of many tomb worlds slipped due to mechanical failure or empiric distortion. Thus, rather than rising up as one across the galaxy, the necrons have awoken piecemeal. Some emerged from stasis during the days of the Emperor's Great Crusade, while many others slumber still. Nor have the necrons themselves come through the process unchanged. Corruption has crept into the minds of many, either during the passing ages or while enduring the slow and unsettling process of revivication. Nihilistic madness or mindless stupor claim some, while the personality engrams of others have been distorted by countless subtle derangements. For all this, many billions of necrons have already awoken, and trillions more stir. Their noble leaders might, in many cases, be mad, but they have lost none of their arrogant sense of superiority, nor their desire for conquest. Every overlord and pharaoh has their own agenda, be it to stockpile and fortify, to raid and destabilize, to send forth imperious envoys, or to begin omnicidal purges of non-necron life. To other races, the necron's behavior seems random to the point of insanity. Yet in truth, most are working towards the same core goals: reconquer the stars they once ruled, and restore to glory whichever dynasty they once belonged to. Most necron nobles are still traditionalists, cleaving to ancient social and martial forms. They impose rigid hierarchies on their underlings and order and deploy their legions in accordance with, or defiance of, the codes of the Triarch that once covered them all. Most importantly, they still fight for their ancient dynasties. Sawtek, Meferet, Nyalok, and Ogdebek, these and countless other dynasties make up the splintered Necron race. All are technically united in subservience to the rule of the Silent King. In truth, many believe themselves as far above their rival dynasties as all Necrons believe their species above the lesser races. Dynasties are as likely to fall into conflict as to ally, and countless smaller dynasties have been subsumed into the territories of larger and more powerful conquerors. For all this, more Necrons awaken all the time. As their numbers grow, so too do the dire threats they pose to the galaxy. Now Zarek, last of the Silent Kings, has returned and seeks to unite his people in galactic conquest again. Whispers precede him, of a diabolical plan to negate the galaxy-ending threat of chaos and subjugate the lesser races once and for all. With his enemies locked in a war of mutual annihilation, and more necrons rallying to his banner by the day, it may be already too late for any to stop him. The relentless march. Upon countless battlefronts across the galaxy, Necron armies are on the attack, perceiving little distinction between the servants of the Emperor, the worshippers of the dark gods, or the teeming Xenos empires that surround them. Imperious Necron nobles send forth their legions to reconquer their interstellar domains by whatever means necessary. The Necrons are best known and feared by their enemies for rising up from beneath their very feet. Countless civilizations have unknowingly settled on worlds that conceal Necron tomb complexes deep beneath the surface. Whether triggered by chronostat or the tomb's master program detecting intrusive life forms, those hidden sleepers awake. If the threat to the tomb complex is deemed significant, the master program prioritizes revivification of the Necron soldiery and war engines. It wields these assets to the best of its ability, employing their might to augment that of its canoptic slave constructs in defending the tomb. Only when the Necron nobility awake to once again take command of their legions do they go on the offensive. In this moment, the doom of the world's flesh and blood colonists is sealed. The earth splits open in yawning fissures, and oceans drain away as the tomb complex rises inexorably to the surface. The skies darken with seething swarms of canoptic scarabs, and the land glitters with the awakening legions as they advance into battle. Fortifications collapse as the ground heaves beneath them, and android killers claw their way out of the earth to trap their victims within the trespassers' own supposedly impregnable bastions. Should reinforcements rush to the aid of the beleaguered planet, they arrive to find the awakened tomb's terrifying defenses and mighty armies waiting for them. Thus are the lesser races slaughtered, and another tomb world secured in the battle for galactic dominance. Were this the only way in which Necrons threaten the planets of the fledgling empires, it would be perilous enough. Yet, time and again, they descend from the heavens to conquer unwary worlds, sometimes appearing to step from thin air into the bloody heat of battle. Such feats are not the sorcery they might appear, but rather due to the ingenuity of the cryptechs. Part courtly viziers, part master engineers, and part cosmic alchemists, the cryptechs wield great influence within Necron society. They possess such a fundamental and far-reaching understanding of the universe's inner workings that, to the lesser races, their abilities appear as witchcraft. No single discipline do the cryptechs pursue. Instead, each individual embarks on a course of obsessive study to whichever field of arcano-scientific lore most fascinates them. Such decisions are based upon whim, aptitude, and often the obsessive madness caused by their long sleep. Often, a cryptech will also select their field of expertise based upon whatever they believe will render them most powerful within the Necron royal courts, and provide them with the most leverage over their rivals and noble masters. Plasmancers, for example, study the martial application of raw energy. They are aggressive warrior scientists whose bodies crawl with skeins of killing power, and who can annihilate their victims with but a gesture. By comparison, disciplines such as psychomancy or chronomancy are far more subtle. The former plays upon the atavistic fears of all living things, while the latter allows the manipulation of the strings of time itself. There are countless other disciplines, from the master engineering skills of the technomancers to the warping powers of the gravmancers, and the insidious abilities of the penumbramancers. Cryptechs are vital not only for their personal abilities. They also construct and maintain the eldritch technologies that allow their masters to launch their conquests in so many terrifying ways. Fleets of tomb ships are one such asset, their drives enabling them to bridge interstellar gulfs almost as quickly as warp travel, and in significantly safer fashion. Terrifying sepulchral battleships of immense size, tomb ships can easily duel the greatest void craft of the lesser races. Yet their greatest value is undoubtedly in spearheading Necron planetary conquests. Should even a single tomb ship settle in low orbit over an enemy world, it will deploy wave upon wave of war engines against its prey, even as its quantum wormhole technologies open the way for invading Necron foot soldiers to assail the enemy in their millions. Dolmen gates are another means of hyper-technological Necron invasion. They were fashioned during the War in Heaven, when the Catan known as Nyadrazatha, the Burning One, gifted the Necrons with the means of their construction. These living stone arches trammel spars of the webway, allowing the Necrons the capability to travel through them. The metallic warriors must be swift, for even subjugated, the semi-sentient network resists and will destroy the Necrons if it can. Such risks prove worthwhile, however. Surprise is total when the lesser races find ancient, long-forgotten ruins flaring suddenly to life upon their worlds, and the deathless Necron legions marching from within. Eldritch Artifice. The Necrons possess a technological base so far in advance of any of the galaxy's other inhabitants that only the artifice of the Eldari warrants even close comparison. This is perhaps unsurprising for a species whose very living forms are mechanical in nature. Certainly, it seems natural enough to the Necron nobility themselves, for it supports their arrogant presumption of superiority over the despised lesser races. Most widespread of all the Necrons' weapons of war is Gauss technology. From the manned portable Gauss flares borne by Necron warriors up to the massive Gauss flux arc, these weapons all function in the same fashion. They project a molecular disassembling beam that reduces flesh, armor, and bone to their constituent atoms, one agonizing layer at a time. Gauss is but one of the horrifying technologies the Necrons employ in battle. Tesla weaponry releases beams of living lightning that scorches and blasts victims and can even arc from one foe to the next. Particle weapons work by emitting streams of minuscule antimatter particles. These detonate on contact with other matter, annihilating their targets in violent blast. Enmitic weaponry, too, is as frightening as it is effective, for its thrumming pulses cause the target's atoms to be violently repelled from one another to spectacular effect. Heavier firepower is provided by such armaments as doomsday weapons or variants of fearsome death ray. Doomsday weapons are plasma-based and possess incredible destructive potential. They are so power-hungry that entire platforms have been developed to facilitate their deployment. Death rays, meanwhile, pour immense energies through a focusing crystal, unleashing a sustained beam of blinding, searing heat and light that carves through targets one after another. While the Necrons typically favor overwhelming ranged firepower as a statement of contempt for the foe, the close-quarter weapons borne by their more elite or murderous warriors are no less deadly. Hyperphase weaponry vibrates across multiple dimensional states, allowing it to pass through a target's defenses without resistance. Void blades work in a similar fashion, but cause their victims' very molecular bonds to collapse at the slightest touch. Some weapons are as much status symbols as they are potent tools of destruction. The Staff of Light serves both as an energized battle scepter and a fearsome short-ranged energy weapon. War scythes, typically carried only by Necron nobility or their Lich Guard protectors, project ethereal energy fields around their tremendously heavy blades. Each swing carves through even the toughest targets as though they were not there. The Cryptechs do not restrict themselves to offensive technologies. Their skills extend to the creation and maintenance of countless other strange devices, all of which benefit the Necron legions on the battlefield. One such technology is quantum shielding. Harnessing the strength of incoming attacks, quantum shields transform that power into harmless equivalent energy. they actually become more effective the stronger the enemy's weaponry. Scarcely less of a bulwark is the dispersion shield borne by retinues of Lichguard. Towering and heavy, it includes layered energy shield generators that not only stop incoming projectiles, but sometimes ricochet them straight back at the foe. Teleportation technologies are much seen amongst Necron armies, typically employing captive wormholes that allow their phalanxes to march straight into battle from the depths of their tombs, or even from the surfaces of far distant worlds. The Eternity Gate of the Monolith can even be reversed to create a portal of exile that drags in screaming foes, jettisoning them into purgatorial nothingness beyond reality itself. Coupled with gravitic repulsion generators, which enable anything from infantry to massive war engines to glide smoothly through the air at considerable speeds. It is not hard to see why Necron armies are far more strategically agile than their warriors' rigid gates would suggest. Technology has also allowed the Necrons to enslave other entities to their will. Some of these were brought into being specifically to serve the needs of their creators, while others were subjugated for all eternity for their crimes against the Necron race. Canoptech constructs proliferate through Necron tomb complexes and armies both. Some are large and powerful, such as the Canoptech Doomstalkers that guard their master's armories, or the Canoptech Spiders that command and control scarabs and other lesser drones. Others have stranger functions, such as the ghostly Canoptech Wraiths, employed to repair inaccessible systems within tomb complexes, or the Canoptech Plasmacytes that isolate and siphon off corrupted engrams from the sleepers within stasis crypts. These latter have been co-opted by the deranged warriors of the destroyer cults, who actually seek to have those same engrammatic patterns injected into themselves, so as to further degrade their former personalities and fuel their nihilistic butchery. Regardless, no Canoptech being is truly sentient. Rather, they are all artificial slaves, utterly incapable of independent thought. The Catan Shards suffer a far worse fate, for they were once the star gods of near limitless power who tricked the Necron tier into bartering away their souls. Zarek's revenge upon these beings saw them shattered by weapons that employed incredible cosmic energies. Yet the Catan were bound to reality itself and could never be destroyed, only splintered into stunted echoes of their former might. Each such shard is still terrifyingly powerful, however, and so the Necrons bound them into extra-dimensional prisons known as Tesseract Labyrinths. When deploying Catan as weapons upon the battlefield, the cryptechs ensure they are technologically shackled, leashed like mindless beasts, and forced to do their master's bidding. Of course, Once in a while, a Catan breaks its straining fetters. At such times, devastating retribution is visited upon the necrons and their foes alike. Tomb Worlds. The armies of the Imperium have encountered necron tomb worlds from one edge of known space to the other. Even still, humanity has discovered but a fragment of the dynastic territories in which the galaxy was once divided. The Necron's worlds are scattered now, many isolated or beset, yet every single one is a mighty stronghold in its own right. None but the Necrons now remember the glory of their star-spanning dynasties from before the Great Sleep. Yet there is little doubt that their holdings have been much abused and eroded in the 60 million years since. When the Silent King ordered his people into their millennial torpor, he did everything he could to protect them. The Necron's cities were converted specifically for the purposes of sustaining and protecting their inhabitants as they slept through the ages. They could not have been better defended or more technologically prepared for their ordeal. Still, the fundamental forces of the galaxy resist stagnation, and the aeons have not been kind. Some tomb worlds were exposed to cosmic phenomena of overwhelming power, be they the explosive deaths of stars, the thunderous impact of huge asteroids, or even the insidious touch of empiric overspill. Plunged into frozen darkness, scorched to bone-dry deserts, irradiated, wrenched and torn by gravitic forces, and blanketed in energy storms. These fates, and many besides, beset tomb worlds and left them inimical to organic life. Of course, such conditions were of little consequence to the Necrons, whose android bodies required none of the fundamentals that flesh and blood creatures did. Indeed, dynasties such as the Nephrek or the Thocht even harnessed and benefited from such deadly conditions. Other tomb worlds have known the expansion of teeming biospheres. Some remain verdant even after the tomb below awakens, the Necron nobility considering the organic flora and fauna a useful camouflage for their fortifications. More often, especially in the case of tomb worlds settled by sentient species, the Necrons swiftly conquer and harvest all that they find on the planet's surface. The awakening legions emerge to find anything from seas of crops to bustling quarries, towering fortifications to sprawling cityscapes, or furious war zones where the lesser races tear at one another, unaware of the doom their conflict has awoken from beneath their feet. Whatever a tomb world's nature or conditions, once the sleepers arise, its fate is irrevocably altered. Land masses shudder, and huge subterranean tomb cities stir beneath the surface. Vast structures force their way upward, slowing off the devastated remains of more youthful civilizations amidst eruptions of magma and seething energy storms. Eerie megastructures ascend into the heavens, ominous guardians taking up watchful stations above the planet as cosmic superweapons flare to life in their flanks. When the command is given by noble or cryptek, swarms of canoptic constructs sweep across the globe, devouring and recycling the works of younger races in order to raise monolithic monuments to their arisen masters. Any trace of the intervening millennia is swept away as the necrons resume rulership of their domains of old. Before the Great Sleep, the worlds of each necron dynasty were ordered and designed according to a strict hierarchical system. Planets were qualified as crown worlds, core worlds, or fringe worlds, with each title bearing significant connotations. At the heart of each dynasty lay its crown world, where the ruling pharaoh sat upon their throne. Crown worlds were as heavily fortified as they were regally magnificent, many playing hosts to incredible megastructures and devices or weapons of godlike power. Each dynasty's resources flowed in towards its crown world, ensuring its legions were the finest and mightiest, as benefited the personal soldiery of the pharaoh themselves. Core worlds made up the inner planets of each dynasty, typically ruled by prominent overlords. They were centers for military might and architectural grandeur that bespoke their dynasty's power. Then there were fringe worlds, those planets furthest from the light of the crown world, and thus considered of least import. Fringe worlds were little more than resource-gathering centers and border fortresses, and as such, their rule was given over to each dynasty's lesser necron lords. However, where once there was order, now there is chaos. Galactic drift and stellar catastrophe has wrought mayhem amidst the once orderly necron dynasties. There is much confusion amongst the awakening nobility, but also opportunity for those able to seize it. Some crown worlds have been shorn of their vassal worlds and are forced to fall back upon their own means. In other cases, fringe worlds rouse to find their former betters annihilated. In such cases, one-time lords name themselves pharaohs and seize control of all the resources and dynastic might they consider their due. Some tomb worlds awaken to bounties of raw materials, and those able to conquer pre-existing advanced civilizations revel in their bloody harvest. Then there are those worlds that awaken to madness. Some lie within the bounds of roiling warp storms and must fend off constant demonic assault. Others wake even as they are being overrun by superior enemy forces, their nobility afforded just enough time to comprehend the horror of their fate before it is sealed. Worst of all, though, are the severed worlds, planets where failures in revivification have left the necrons as mindless shells, puppeted in a hollow parody of existence by master programs that can never relinquish control to their damned masters. The Pharaon's legions. Every Necron world is organized to strict dynastic codes, from the glittering nobility who rule to the mighty legions that march out to enforce their masters' wills. Rare indeed is the tomb world that breaks from this rigid martial order. Every tomb world is governed by its ruling noble, be they pharaoh, overlord, or lord. These rulers are surrounded by their royal court, an assemblage of lesser nobles, nemesors who command the royal legions, royal wardens who serve as lieutenants and bodyguards, menacing retinues of lich guard and scheming knots of cryptech viziers. Much politicking and intrigue goes on in these courts, for most Necrons who retained personalities after biotransference remained both ambitious and ruthless. Most Necron rulers find the best way to promote unity amongst their vassals is to set them against a common foe. When the legions march to war, these determined and knowledgeable leaders become valuable assets to their liege lords. Lesser nobles make regal battlefield commanders. Royal wardens act as lieutenants, varguards, or even diplomatic envoys, while cryptechs keep the dynastic legions on the march and unleash their strange cryptosciences to cripple the enemy and aid their own forces. Another factor keeps the Necron nobility in order, both on and off the battlefield. The Triarch Praetorians, hands of the Silent King, stand as arbiters of the ancient dynastic codes, apart from the structure of the tomb worlds. The Praetorians possess the Triarch-given right to pass judgment upon the honor and conduct of all, even ruling pharaohs. Normally, though, they restrict themselves to the battlefield, where they hang suspended by their gravity displacement packs as battle commences. From their vantage point, they assess the conduct of the foe. In rare cases, they may deem an enemy truly sentient and thus deserving of the ancient codes of honor. In such circumstances, frustrated Necron nobles find themselves forbidden from deploying dishonorable assets such as death marks, X marks destroyers, and flayed ones. More often than not, however, they deem the enemy little better than vermin and descend to join in their extermination. Most Necron legions are built around a core of phalanx upon phalanx of Necron warriors. Neurally stunted and grindingly obedient, warriors are spent freely by their uncaring masters. Most nobles are more concerned that their warriors' adornments display their leader's status than they are with keeping these peons safe from enemy attacks. The warrior phalanxes require constant direction. Without this, they can manage little more than to hold position and shoot at nearby foes. Properly directed, however, their firepower and resilience make warrior phalanxes ideal for pinning the enemy in place, grinding them into dust, or blunting their most furious counteroffenses. Most Necron legions supplement their warrior phalanxes with formations of more elite and substantially more self-aware soldiery. From bands of tough and tactically independent immortals to sharp-shooting deathmark assassins, and hurtling swarms of Tombblade attack speeders. The dynasties can draw upon a range of strategically specialized military assets to lend their legions the edge in battle. Necron nobles make no secret of the fact that they consider the vehicles of their capacious armories to be more precious than the Necrons who pilot them, or indeed the foot soldiers who march to battle in the war engine's shadow. The Necrons are a people who have always equated their vast technological superiority with an undeniable right to dominate. Every cosmically powered weapon and reality-warping engine is a statement that the Pharaons possess the power to trammel stars and shatter gods. Thus is the armory of each tomb world not only a concerted display of each ruler's martial might, wealth, and status, but also a material manifestation of their right as supreme being to create and destroy whatever and however they see fit. Some elements of their armies are held in contempt by Necron nobles, such as canoptic slave constructs or Catan shards that are imprisoned as weapons or power sources. Yet there are other sects in Necron society that take to the battlefield alongside the legions, but who the nobility have little, if any, command over. Foremost amongst these are the destroyer cults. While many strains of insanity have afflicted the Necrons, the nihilistic murder madness of the destroyers has proven pernicious and increasingly widespread. Destroyers eschew all notion of personal ambition, desire, or hope, instead descending into a pit of cold and calculated hatred that sees them seek the eradication of all organic life. There are many subcults, from the Locust, with their grav-sled bodies and heavy firepower, to the blade-armed Skorpek, or the debased subterranean Ophidian, that share one common demand of the Cryptex, which is to have their bodies altered into whatever form they believe optimal for the slaughter of all living things. The Necron nobles employ destroyers as shock troops. However, they do not trust them. Not only do many fear the destroyer's madness to be infectious, but they wonder whom they will turn upon when all organic victims are slain. The flayed ones, too, are feared and reviled by the rest of Necron society. exiled to languish in the horrific nether realm known as the Bone Kingdom of Drazak, they are afflicted with the hideous death curse of the Catan known as Landugor the Flayer. Twisted in body and mind, flayed ones are drawn to the scent of blood, scissoring open the flesh of reality and spilling through from their ghastly realm to fall upon the necrons' foes. The dynastic legions make every effort to avoid these beings, whose madness they fear as catching, but they can do little to stop the flayed ones from joining battles that are already underway. The Silent King, supreme ruler of the Necron dynasties. Last of the Silent Kings, shatterer of the star gods, defeater of the old ones, bringer of unity, master of the final triarch, wielder of the scepter of eternal glory. These are but a handful of the grand titles earned by Zarek, the ruler of the Necron race. His endless honorifics paint a glorious picture, but in truth, his gleaming image is tainted by an inner darkness few see. Few beings in the galaxy possess the might, wisdom, and sweeping vision of Zarek, last of the Silent Kings. During the nightmarish transition of biotransference, it was Zarek who emerged with the most powerful and advanced of all the bodies gifted to the newly fashioned Necron race. His neurological and sensory architecture, while wholly synthetic, is more advanced and precise than anything flesh and blood could emulate. His powerful android form is mechanical perfection, on a level that no sentient being now alive could replicate. Smooth and graceful in its every motion, irresistible in its strength, and regal and intimidating in its magnificent presence. Neither mental nor physical ailments can ever afflict the Silent King. His mind remains more wholly his own than any amongst his people, for he was ever their ruler and did not endure the perils of the Great Sleep or subsequent revivification that have driven so many Necrons mad. For all this, Zarek suffers, as he has suffered ever since he realized the purgatory to which he consigned his people. Millennia have heaped upon millennia, and still the Silent King's guilt remains as jagged and bitter within him as it once was. His sorrow and horror have been preserved by his mechanized mind as perfectly as has every single memory, thought, and feeling Zarek has experienced since the day of his biotransference. It can be said with certainty that such an impossible burden as this would have driven even the most resilient of living beings to madness and self-destruction aeons ago. Zarek, though, is not truly living, and his torments have not destroyed him. Instead, they have honed him into a being of horrifying and singular determination. The Silent King has a plan for his people and for the galaxy, and he knows that he is righteous with the inescapable, unwavering certainty of a god, of a machine. Zarek's will is a star erupting in supernova, a comet colliding with a doomed world. He is as inevitable as time and tide. The Silent King seeks nothing less than final atonement for the fate to which he consigned his race, and none shall be permitted to stand in his way. Zarek was not always so singular in his obsession. When the end of the war in heaven came and the last of the Catan had been shattered, he recognized that his people could not withstand further conflict. The allies and servants of the Old Ones were circling, wary but vengeful, and so he ordered the Great Sleep. Zarek envisioned a future where the enemies would be defeated by strife and time. Necrons would arise unsuspected from their long sleep. They would seize control of the galaxy using their deathless bodies and cosmic weapons. And then, freed from conflict and unshackled from the ravages of time and mortality, they would at last devise a way to reverse biotransference and therefore expunge Zarek's sins. The Silent King would not share this in his process, however. For himself, Zarek chose exile aboard his vast, city-sized warship, Song of Oblivion. Zarek took many of his own dynasty with him into the intergalactic void. Entombed within stasis crypts of their own, but awakening in regular cycles to crew and garrison his vast ship. None amongst the dynasties truly know what the Silent King sought beyond the stars. Detractors like Emotech or Zarathustra the Ineffable claim he fled with no more intent than to escape his crimes. Others, Pharaon Asmonthep of the Zarkon dynasty and the royal court of Nyalok, not least among them, believe he had a greater purpose. Perhaps, some speculate, Zarek even sought a cure for biotransference in the lightless realms beyond the galactic rim. Maybe he intended to travel to other galaxies entirely, and there find the solution to his people's woes. None but Zarek himself knows the truth, and, as with many of the more troubling mysteries surrounding the Silent King, his race find themselves unable to recall whether they themselves ever knew the answer. From which dynasty did Zarek originally hail? What characterized his rule before biotransference? When precisely did he return to the galaxy? And for how long did he operate from the shadows before openly declaring his return? Even beings like Oricon the Diviner, who was once Zarek's court astrologer, find strange gaps in their artificial memories concerning such things. More unsettling still, they rarely seem able to focus on these doubts long enough to seek any answers. For all the gaps in recollection that veil elements of Zarek's life, at least his motivation for returning to the galaxy appears straightforward. The Silent King abandoned exile to save his people from the menace of the Tyranids. It is said that he encountered dormant hive fleets flowing through the intergalactic darkness towards the galaxy he had left behind, and recognized the perils they represented. What if they devoured all life before the necrons could reverse biotransference? Worse, what if Zarek's people had already managed their apotheosis just in time to be devoured in turn? Supposedly driven by pure altruism and a desire to not fail his people again, Zarek turned the Song of Oblivion back towards the distant glimmer of the stars he had known so long ago. This story in itself has holes. What did Zarek witness, and on what scale, that so convinced him of this omnipresent peril? How did he chance across encroaching Tyranids amidst the near infinite gulfs of space? Questions of pretext and motivation have been raised, however briefly, by the more rebellious amongst the royal courts, and whispers persist that the Silent King harbors some other, deeper agenda. Few find themselves able to sustain their doubts for long, however, and for those who do, the Triarch Praetorians are never far behind. Such shadows and whispers soon burn away in the searing light of Zarek's presence. It is said that merely meeting the Silent King in person is to transform even the keenest doubter into a supplicant desperate to do his will. Shortly after revealing himself openly to his people, Zarek chose two pharaohs of lesser dynasties who had proven their loyalty through swift service. Subsuming their legions into Zarekon ranks, the Silent King elevated Hapthratra the Radiant and Mesophet of the Shadowed Hand to form his new Triarch. They became the Pharaon of the Stars and the Pharaon of the Blades, as the ancient codes dictated, joining Zarek upon his mighty dais of domination, from where they could proclaim the Triarch's will. There are those who have noted how thoroughly the two pharaons are bound into the dais, how their voices have taken on a new tone of command since their ascension, and how they speak nearly always with perfect synchronicity. But of course, elevation to the final Triarch was bound to affect changes upon such minor rulers. And if they seem always to support Zarek's plans without question, those plans were millennia in the laying, after all. Who could honestly suggest amendments to such a comprehensive scheme? The martial might of the final Triarch, at least, is beyond question. Zarex's dais is empowered by a caged shard of Naiad Drazatha himself, while the Silent King's mantle is formed from the Cataan's flint necrodermis. It is the Burning One's own fire that Zarek amplifies through his regal scepter of eternal glory, sending it blazing forth in searing beams of absolute destruction. That same energy is channeled into the potent carrier wave generators of the dais that coordinate and motivate nearby necron soldiery, and also in the Noctilith beacons held high above Zarek's throne. These beacons not only banish the infernal energies of the warp, but also allow the Silent King to tear open the invisible skeins of the webway, fashioning his own temporary dolmen gates to bear him swiftly across vast interstellar gulfs. Those foes not erased by Zarek's energy blasts are far from safe. While Hapthatra unleashes flurries of neutron orbs from the Staff of Stars, Mesophet hefts a scythe of dust, every swing of its glimmering blade reducing victims to swirling clouds of scorched particles. Enemies who get close enough to strike at Zarek directly are forced to their knees by the thrumming energies of his dais's obeisance generators. Even those blows that manage to hit home are unlikely to do harm. The Silent King and his companions are swathed in transtemporal fields that scatter the force of the foe's attacks, and thus dissipates them harmlessly. All the while, a pair of triarchal menhirs orbits Zarek's dais, proclaiming the Triarch's omnipotent might, even as they channel the dais's power. By focusing the resonance of these devices, Zarek can unleash a devastating annihilator beam, an energy weapon so potent that it has been likened to the hurled spear of an enraged god. None who feel its wrath live to tell the tale. Before life, before the cosmic dust of creation coalesced into the magma cores around which planets would cool and form, at the moment of the galaxy's first beat of existence, there was the Catan, shaped from the very energy unleashed from the galactic dawn of time itself. Stories and myths would emerge billions of years later, recounting the tales of these malevolent beings and their role in changing the course of the universe. But in their primordial form, they were far from the stain their future held. They were simply a parasitic energy, wrapping themselves around and drinking from the very same stars birthed alongside them. Eons would pass, and the Catan would learn to traverse along the lines of electromagnetic flux that stretched the universe, to find new feeding grounds, ignorant of the solid matter that began permeating galaxies with life. For now, the Catan would remain unaware of life flourishing within the galaxy. For when their attention was diverted, world after world would burn. Just as the universe and the galaxies within spun to life, so too did the galaxies contain life of their own. In our home galaxy, the Milky Way, there was an ancient species known as the Old Ones, extremely potent with psychic abilities and seemingly immortal. This species was known for its slow and cold-blooded wisdom and intelligence, and was thought to be both reptilian in nature and the first species in our galaxy to become fully self-aware. Through their advanced intellect and technology, alongside their psychic prowess, the Old Ones held sway over both the materium and the immaterium. And with this mastery, they created what would eventually be known as the Webway, a labyrinth dimension that sits between the warp and real space, often interpreted as a large tangled network of doors known as warp gates, each of which connects fixed points within the materium, which allowed the Old Ones to navigate to essentially anywhere in the galaxy in a single step. The Old Ones used their advanced technology and understanding to help nurture the much younger races of the galaxy, even going as far to seed life across many worlds themselves. Notably, among these seeded races would be the Eldari, the Krorks, who would eventually evolve into orcs, and potentially even primitive humanity upon Terra. But to suggest such an idea within the Imperium of Man would be nothing short of heresy. To the Old Ones, life was precious, and in their benevolent wisdom, they sought to foster the myriad races across the galaxy. The Old Ones reached the pinnacle of their technology and civilization over 60 million years ago. But growing even more technologically advanced alongside them was a humanoid race known as the Necrontyr. And the relationship between these two races would forever change the course of galaxy and universe alike. In the dark corner of the galaxy, known as the Halo Stars region, billions of years ago, there lived, under a harsh and unforgiving star, the Necrontyr. A morbid people, the Necrontyr lived precariously short lives, their flesh and blood poisoned and diseased by incessant solar winds and radiation storms. To them, life was but a brief blip lived in anticipation of a shortly coming and more permanent death, and their culture and cities reflected this. Grand sepulchres and tomb complexes bathed their civilization in shadow. Monuments to honor the dead, never the living. This was the truth of the Necrontyr, no dynasty immune to its irradiated touch. As such, driven by instinct and necessity, the Necrontyr needed to leave their homeworld behind them, to spread amongst the stars, free from the damning energies of their birth star. Their technological advancement created this opportunity for them. They created slow-moving, antimatter-powered torch ships, made from a living metal known as necrodermis, which had the ability to repair itself of almost any damage done to it. In these ships, they rested within stasis crypts to ensure that the millennia's long travel would not see their life long over before their exodus concluded. And little by little, Necrontyr dynasties spread out across the galaxy, colonizing worlds, until much of the ancient galaxy answered to their rule. While many different Necrontyr dynasties ruled over many different worlds over the galaxy, the race as a whole was still unified and governed by the Triarch, a council which comprised three of the most powerful dynasty's monarchs known as Pharaons. The head of the Triarch was known simply as the Silent King, for his words were addressed to his subjects through the two additional Pharaons who governed along with him. It was sometime during the Necrontyr's slow expansion through the galaxy that they encountered the Old Ones. While the Necrontyr were arguably more technologically advanced, the Old Ones possessed two things they did not: the ability to use and conceive the immaterium and the psychic powers drawn from it to bolster their lives and technology, and the secrets to immortality. Despite their exodus from their homeworld, the Necrontyr still bore the irradiated curse of their birth star. And the Old One's mastery of immortality and their disinclination to share it with them kindled a burning, jealous rage within the hearts of the Necrontyr, which would eat away at their spirits as much as the cancers ate at their flesh. Time would go on for the Necrontyr, but as it did, more strife would find its way to them. As their interstellar territory grew ever larger and ever more diverse, the unity forged between the dynasties in the race, the very thing that made them strong, began to corrode, and war erupted in its place. Each dynasty hoped to carve out its own destiny, its own place in the wider galaxy, and so the great houses clashed against one another. While the Necrontyr were plagued with a shorter lifespan, that did nothing to shorten the list of grudges, rivals, or simple petty jealousy, political or otherwise, that they clung tightly to. The wars of secession raged across the Necrontyr Empire. The Triarch reasoned that should action not be taken, and should circumstances of this war remain, it wouldn't be long before their race would wipe themselves from the galaxy, suffering the same fate many unknown and unnamed races had before them and will continue to do after they're gone. This Triarch, under the reign of the last of the Silent Kings, Zarek, sought to bring commonality to their people once more. To this end, they brought a common hatred to the forefront and declared the Necrontyr to war against the Old Ones. Zarek pledged to his people that should the Old Ones not willingly share the secrets of their immortality with them, then the Necrontyr would litter the galaxy with their ashes and take it from them. For the war effort, the Silent King offered amnesty to the secessionist dynasties that laid their feuds down and returned to the fold to fight side by side rather than against their fellow Necrontyr. The Silent King's ploy worked. The wars of secession came to an abrupt stop. The Necrontyr dynasties pledging themselves to the war effort and to the spoils of a victory that promised immortality. In an instant, Zarek set in motion a conflict that would see the galaxy itself tremble, a war that would span the heavens. He was successful in uniting his people in their hate, and sent them, blinded by this hate, to march into a war they could not win. The wars that followed the Silent King's gambit of unity for his people would later be known in Eldari myth as the War in Heaven. It is said that the history and accounts of this war would fill an entire library in its own right. But while most of this information has been lost to time, many facts still persist. The Necrontyr took to the stars, their engines thrumming to the sound of war, to fight for an end to their curse, for immortality. Though their technology was superior to that of the Old Ones, their downfall would come from their enemies' mastery of the webway and warp gates. The Old Ones outmaneuvered the Necrontyr at every turn, disrupting supply lines, cutting off reinforcements, constantly destabilizing the Necrontyr and their Triarch's war plans. So overwhelming was the Old Ones' use of the webway that the Necrontyr were pushed further and further back, until they were forced to their irradiated homeworld, left as a speck of an annoyance at the far reaches of the galaxy, where they would cling to their hatred alone and out of sight, under the accursed gaze of their birth star. This defeat fractured the Necrontyr more than ever before. Exiled and forgotten on their cruel homeworld plagued their pride and their mind, just as the sun plagued their flesh and their blood. They developed a seething hatred for all intelligent life in the universe, and determined themselves to avenge their defeat upon their enemies. Yet, this rage would be tempered by millennia-long imprisonment. It would never disappear from them entirely. However, the unity of the Necrontyr dynasties of a common enemy would soon dissipate. Generations of Necrontyr from houses both great and low had lived and died in the service of the Silent King's unwinnable war. And so that unity became more fractured than it ever had been before, and the second iteration of the Wars of Secession imploded the Necrontyr Empire. So ruinous were these wars that if the Old Ones had had the inclination to wipe the Necrontyr from existence, they could have. This act of ignorance, or perhaps benevolence, would be looked back upon as the deciding factor of the Old One's fall. Zarek and the Triarch became even more desperate than before. All around them, their people fought amongst themselves. Houses were snuffed out, dynasties collapsed. The existence of the race stood upon the precipice of dust and ash. The Triarch's frantic search for the means of restoring peace and order came as the clock's hand told the Necrontyr's final hour, and the price to be paid for it was everything. The Triarch faced an almost impossible dilemma: restore order or watch their race purge themselves from the galaxy. The call to war to face their common enemy was now irrelevant. They could not defeat the Old Ones on their own, and time was running short for the Necrontyr. But it was in their darkest hour that their prayers were answered, or so they believed. The dust-covered tomes and scrolls held within the library on the tomb world of Solemnance claim that by accident and sheer luck, a stellar probe made a discovery while investigating a dying star within the Halo Star region. As part of Necrontyr scientists' desperate attempts to understand the region's stars in hopes of protecting themselves from its plaguing touch. This discovery was that of an intelligent ethereal being made of energy, having wrapped itself around the nearby star and was feeding upon it. To the Necrontyr, this godlike being was the solution to their conundrum. These were their star gods, or Catan in their native language, who would free them from strife and give them the edge they needed to bring retribution to their hated enemy. They believe the Catan were the progeny of the death god they had long worshipped. These beings of immaculate energy, these stars made animate, were the weapon the Triarch had prayed for. How the Silent King made contact with these star gods is unknown, but contact was made nonetheless. Knowing that these ethereal beings of raw energy could not perceive the universe around them without the ability to manifest into the material form, the Necrontyr forged for them a physical shell made from their living metal necrodermis, so that the Catan might take physical form. The star vampires coiled into their new necrodermis bodies and perceived for the first time this new material existence. An existence they would come to appreciate, the pleasures of corporeal life, the delicious trickles of electromagnetic energy pouring off the physical bodies of the Necrontyr. A new hunger awoke within the Catan that day, but they were not so unwise as to begin feeding upon the necrontyr in a frenzy. How much more life was out in the galaxy, they wondered. How could the necrontyr be of assistance in understanding the new universe they were in? How could the necrontyr be manipulated into being their forward army, heralding the arrival of their feast? So it was that one Catan came before the Silent King, the forerunner of his brothers to come. This was Mephitron, the Deceiver. Yet the Catan's nature was unknown to Zarak. The Deceiver spoke to the Silent King of an ancient feud, a war fought between the Catan and the Old Ones, far before the birth of the necrontyr. A war, the Deceiver said, the Catan had lost, and in their defeat, in fear of the Old Ones, they hid themselves away in the darkest recesses of the galaxy, awaiting a time in which they found allies that could use to bring about vengeance. In a bid for alliance with the Silent King, the Deceiver assured him that everything the necrontyr had craved would be theirs: retribution, unity, and immortality. These gifts and more to be given to them by the Catan at no cost, for these were to be boons for their valued allies. How much of these words were true, not even the Deceiver could know. Nonetheless, these words held great sway over Zarak. For many months, he discussed the matter with the other Pharaons of the Triarch, as well as with the nobles of his royal court. Through all of it, the only voice of protest was that of Oricons, the court astrologer. He prophesied that the alliance between necrontyr and Catan would come to bear a renaissance of glory and the victory they so desired, but that its price would forever destroy the soul of their people. The caution of the Silent King was quickly made invalid by desire and ambition, and Oricon's prophecy was dismissed. 1 year after the Deceiver first met with Zarak and made his offer, the Silent King accepted, in doing so, forever dooming his people. The drums of war sounded once more, armed with weapons of godlike power and a new quantum phase technology that could surge their starships across the galaxy in an instant. The necrontyr were eager to let loose their hatred upon the Old Ones, but the Catan had one last gift for their new allies: a path to immortality, an end to living in their diseased flesh, replaced by bodies made up of necrodermis, just like the bodies the Catan inhabited. Metal forms that could repair and replenish themselves, allowing them to pursue the Old Ones until the very last, while being free from death. Thus began the Great Biotransference. Great biofoundries were constructed, and into the constructs, the Silent King and the necrontyr people marched. While we can't know what blasphemous procedures the necrontyr were exposed to within, we do know that each was stripped of both their flesh and their soul, and their body replaced by a shell of living metal, animated by whatever remained of their conscious guttering selves. As Zarak himself emerged from the biofoundry, he watched as above each furnace the ethereal forms of the Catan feasted and glutted themselves upon both the spiritual and electromagnetic remnants of an entire race. It was only then that he saw the twisted and awful truth of the pact he had made. While in myriad ways, he felt better physically than he ever had. The strength and vigor of a god were now his. thoughts that were clear, and a mind of deep and unforgetting intelligence, a body encased in living alloy and eternal. Yet for all of that, there would be a constant gnawing at his and all of the Necrontyrs' minds, an inexpressible hollow, the absence of spirit. For the price to be paid was the souls of an entire people. Even though the price was steep, the C'tan's promise had been fulfilled. Life eternal was theirs, from the highest among them to the lowest. Their cursed sun could do little to rust and erode their new mechanical bodies, and only the most destructive and complete of injuries could destroy them fully. The process of biotransference had also embedded an engrammatic command protocol in each of the Necrons' minds, which granted the Silent King the unyielding, unswerving loyalty of his subjects. Zarek at first embraced this welcome reprieve of guaranteed unity and an end to the fractiousness of their race. But as time would pass, Zarek would become weary of this burden and lonely. But, in fear of what his people would do to him for visiting the curse of soullessness upon them, he dared not to sever the command protocol. Biotransference left nothing behind but the ghostly echoes of the Necrontyrs' consciousnesses. Only the most intelligent and strong-willed of their people retained their intellect as well as their self-awareness, albeit as shadows of who they once were. Only one thing remained as a collective amongst them: their hatred for all living and intelligent species across the galaxy. Now, with both the C'tan and the Necrontyr empowered as never before, they took that rage to the heavens to leave a trail of broken and burning stars and worlds in their wake. The short-lived, cancer-addled Necrontyr walked into the foundries that day, and the soulless, undying Necrons marched out. Legions of the undying Necrons set out into the galaxy aboard their tomb ships, reignited as ever before in their hatred of the Old Ones. The C'tan's mastery over the physical universe would see the Old Ones countered in their use of the webway, and where they once could outmaneuver the Necrons, now they were simply doomed. The feast of Necrontyr souls had empowered the C'tan beyond comprehension. They raised entire planets, extinguished suns without a thought, even conjured black holes to consume entire star systems. The star gods and their legions of undying warriors were nigh on unstoppable in their slaughter-filled conquest across the Milky Way. The war in heaven is reignited in full. With the aid of the C'tan known as Nyadrazath, the Burning One, the Necrons were able to construct portal gates of living stone known as dolmen gates, which allowed them to enter the webway. With the webway breached, the Necrons assaulted the Old Ones at every corner of the galaxy. However, it was not just the Old Ones who felt the calculated sting of the Necrons' wrath. So too did the undying machines lay siege to the colonies and strongholds of other younger and intelligent species, leading their C'tan masters into feeding frenzy after feeding frenzy. In the wake of unending victories, they now dominated the galaxy, as the last of the Old Ones' planetary citadels were besieged. A race that once nurtured life across the galaxy had become merely more than livestock for the incessant hunger of the C'tan. But there was still a sliver of hope for these ancient peoples. For reasons unknown, the C'tan began to fight amongst themselves. Some suggest it was merely for sport or out of spite. Others say their hunger simply knew no bounds. And Eldari myth says that it was their laughing god that tricked the Catan known as the Outsider into turning against his brothers in a bid for ascendancy, which sparked a civil war. Even as Catan fought against Catan, whole worlds and solar systems were the casualties of this conflict, and the galaxy continued to suffer. It came to a point where the Old Ones, known and defined by the patience and unbreakable will, became desperate in the wake of the Necrons' assault and the galaxy-shaking inner conflict of the Star Gods. With their grand intellect and mastery of both science and the warp, they sought to genetically engineer an intelligent species with an even stronger psychic link to the warp, in hopes that they would be able to channel this psychic power in a way that would turn the tides of the war. In doing so, they nurtured many more potential warrior species, chief amongst these being the Eldari. The war in heaven raged on. Millennia passed before the fruits of the Old One's creations came to be, even while the Necron continued to extinguish life across the galaxy and push the Old Ones back even closer to the brink of extinction. Now, with the Eldari nearing the height of their power, they clashed with the Necron and Catan forces. The psychic power of the Eldari's warp magic decimated the legions of the undying machines, and now it was the Necrons that were being driven back yet again. As the magical forces of the Immaterium were anathema to the soulless metal constructs, whose entire existence was wholly contained as an electromagnetic force. For all the destructive and technological powers the Necron could muster, they could not stop the Eldari's psychic advance against them, and the Catan's empire began to shatter. For the first time in millions of years, the Catan became unified in the face of this psychic threat, seeking a way to defeat the powers of the Immaterium. Their plan was to construct a great warding, one that would seal the material universe completely off from the warp, a plan of which its first steps could be found upon the world of Cadia in the form of great pylons that dotted the planet's surface. It wouldn't be long before the Catan would succeed, but before their plan could come to fruition, the seeds of destruction planted by the Old Ones in their desperate attempt to stop the Necron advance brought about an unforeseen cataclysm. The grand psychic powers of the Eldari, paired with the growing pains of a young race and the psychic flaws of their collective, threw the Immaterium into chaos, as it were. Destruction, pain, war, all mirrored from the Eldari into the fathomless depths of the warp, as the Sea of Souls became a maelstrom of energy. Older entities that had long existed in the warp became disfigured and transformed into awful and terrifying psychic predators who tore at the fabric of reality to pull themselves from the Immaterium and devour the souls of countless beings across the galaxy. The warp was disfigured beyond recognition, torn apart and reformed into the realm of chaos. Frenzied by the voracious use of psychic activity raging across the Materium, the denizens of the warp were forever changed. They gathered in mass at the cracks between the Immaterium and the Materium, desperate and eager to enter the material realm. Just as the tides of war were changing in their favor, the Old Ones were faced with a new and overwhelming threat to their dwindling empire. Despite the new genetically engineered warrior species they brought into the fold to defend their last bastions, namely the technology-mimicking Jokero and the green-skinned Krork, it was simply too late. The webway was breached by the creatures of the warp, and the Old Ones were forced to destroy several of their warp gates, just to prevent the entities from the Immaterium from spreading to more uncorrupted worlds. The webway was now lost to the Old Ones, and the horrors spilling into real space which would consume them and all life in the galaxy was a direct consequence of their own making. The most horrific of these warp entities were the enslavers, who had the ability to completely dominate the mind of the younger species, using them to create their own portals into the Materium. And if it were one of the myriad of psychers that dotted the galaxy, they were brought into real space by even greater numbers. The Old Ones had opened Pandora's box in their desperation to halt the Necrons' burning advance across the galaxy. Life stood defiant upon the precipice of apocalypse and extinction during the war in heaven. But now, as the enslaver plague was unleashed into the universe, the survivors appeared only to be doomed. This was the final disaster for the Old Ones. Their civilization and strongholds destroyed and overrun. The young races they nourish possessed and bringing uncountable cosmic horrors into the galaxy. They had little hope of winning a war on two fronts. Their webway lost to them, their reign and time in the galaxy was over. Whether the Old Ones were brought to an inevitable extinction, scattered and destroyed, or they simply fled the Milky Way to find a new haven in the undiscovered reaches of the universe, is unknown. All throughout the latter half of the war in heaven, Zarek the Silent King bided his time, awaiting the moment of his grand betrayal. Even with the command and power of the entirety of the Necrons' legions, he couldn't have hoped to oppose the Catan at the height of their power. He watched, waited, and he hated them for everything they took from the Necrontyr in their deception. But as the war in heaven raged on, and Catan would turn against Catan, and the Old One's psyker races would also weaken their advance, Zarek's time was drawing near. Then, at the apex of the enslaver plague, their ancient hated enemy was defeated, and the Catan were spent from their long and hard-fought victory. It was only then that the Silent King revealed his pointed gun, and even in their arrogance, the Catan wouldn't see the smoking barrel until it was too late. Under Zarek's order, the finest cryptex of the Necrons had constructed god-killing hypercannons capable of focusing the unimaginable energies of the living universe. A blast so intense that not even the Catan could withstand the wrath of this impossibly powerful weapon. Even now, the greatest and most intelligent overlords of the Necrons barely remember the battle against their star gods, as causality itself was maimed by the destructive energies required to dismantle the Catan. The Silent King, as well, was sure to remove the knowledge of such weapons from his subjects, in fear of what could later be done with them if their existence was known. However, the Catan were immortal spawns of the stars, and part of the fundamental fabric of reality, and so their complete annihilation was impossible. But this wasn't unknown to Zarek, and so he planned accordingly. Instead of their total destruction, the Catan were sundered into thousands of smaller and less powerful fragments, each fragment retaining the personality of the Catan as a whole.
The fragments were all each bound within a multi-dimensional tesseract labyrinth, imprisoned for eternity. The cost of dealing with the Catan was once more steep. Millions more necrons were destroyed in their rebellion, including all the members of the Triarch besides the Silent King. Alas, victory was theirs, and with it, the freedom to command their own destiny. Victory against both their ancient hatreds and their godly oppressors belonged to the Necrons. But the consequences of all the galaxy's actions from then until now was still a galaxy on fire, and a war against the violent powers of the Eldari Psykers that the Silent King knew they could not win. The Eldari had survived where the Old Ones had not, and he knew that galactic dominion belonged to them for now, and that the Necrons' time in the galaxy was at an end, at least for an age. Yet he knew that this enemy would as well succumb to extinction, as it must for all beings still made of flesh, even if it took millions of years. So, the Silent King ordered that the remaining of the Necron cities be converted into grand tomb complexes filled with stasis crypts. Let the Eldari control the galaxy for a time. They were but ephemeral, and the Necron were undying and eternal. And thus did the Silent King command his final order: to sleep. Sleep a great sleep, for the equivalent of 60 million standard years. And when that 60 million years is up, awaken and rebuild all that they had lost. Restore the great Necrontyr dynasties in all their former glory. As the last Necrons laid into their stasis crypts for their great sleep, and the last of the tomb worlds was sealed in their subterranean vaults, Zarek destroyed the engrammatic command protocols that had allowed him to control his people for so long. For in his mind, he had completely and utterly failed them. And, without so much as a glance backwards, the last of the Silent Kings took his ship into the starless black void of intergalactic space to find whatever penance or solace he could find. Eons have passed, and the Necrons sleep on, their machine constructs guarding the tomb worlds during their slumber, awaiting the Great Awakening in a galaxy ripe for conquest. But many of these tomb worlds would fall to misfortune and disruption. Most were minor inconveniences, but for others the effects were far more calamitous. Some destroyed in retribution by Eldari forces. Some stars went supernova, consuming worlds the Necrons slumbered upon. Tectonic shifts in other planets crushed the tomb complexes in their sleep. Their Great Awakening had been anything but precise. They have not risen as a singular people, but in intermittent starts over scattered millennia. Awakening to a galaxy riven by war, not unlike the one they had hoped to leave behind. The Eldari were but a fraction of themselves, but newer threats had emerged from every corner of the galaxy, namely the Imperium of Man. But the Necrons are an immortal, undying empire, their technology still unmatched by any star-faring civilization, and time is always on their side. The war in heaven took its toll upon the Necron dynasties, annihilating many entirely. Time has seen more still eradicated as tomb complexes have slipped into true and abiding death. Still,
a vast number of dynasties remain, each with their own tomb worlds, unique heraldry, and cultural and military predispositions. Indeed, there are far more dynasties abroad amongst the stars than even humanity's darkest nightmares would envision. The Zarkon dynasty. If this dynasty was once known by a different name, biotransference, or the mental command of Zarek himself, erased it from memory. Those of the Zarkon dynasty know only that it was from their number that the last silent king arose, and that by his word they are to be considered preeminent. But with Zarek's command protocols gone, many of their rival dynasties are less convinced. The Zarkon dynasty were comparatively slow to wake. Their worlds had been scattered by galactic catastrophes, the greatest of which was the onset of warp storm Asmodor in M18. Many of their tomb complexes had been destroyed, whether by natural disasters or the vengeful attention of the Eldari, who sought out Zarkon worlds with particular venom. Nor were the Eldari the only foes from ancient days. With Zarek's command protocol severed, many dynasties awoke with a burning resentment towards the Zarkon. Who were they to have set themselves above all? Some nobles asked. Others blamed them for every horror of the war in heaven, holding them to account for the perceived misdeeds of their absent leader. More than one rival dynasty acted violently upon such feelings, and between this hostile attention and that of the lesser races, it is a testament to the Zarkon dynasty's skill in strategy and martial artifice that they survived at all. Yet survive they did, beset upon all sides but haughty in their sense of superiority. Their nobles believed with the fervor of prophecy that the Silent King would return and reward their loyalty. Many amongst the rival dynasties feared this might prove true. If the Zarkon were undeserving, they asked, why then did the Triarch Praetorians ally themselves so readily to their cause? Often fighting in the Zarkon defense even against other necrons. And why did their cryptechs envy skills in the crafting of weapons, armored bodies, and potent war engines more formidable than those of any other dynasty? It was not simply that they recruited the most skilled cryptechs, not only that the revivification and repair facilities deep within the Zarkon tombs operated with the greatest finesse and efficiency. No, this was something deeply buried in the Necrons' artificial psyches, something that manifested in an almost supernatural fashion, so that even lesser dynasties, subsumed into the Zarkon totality, soon exhibited these same traits. Was it some final blessing bestowed by the Silent King to ensure that his people would always endure? This, at least, was the Zarkon Pharaon's claim. Now that Zarek has returned, his dynasty hold themselves vindicated, revealing ancient treasures and monstrous superweapons long hoarded against this day. The the Zarkon enclaves push rapidly outward, launching countless attacks to draw enemies away from the sites where the Silent King is raising his contra-empiric matrix. Many smaller dynasties have already flocked to ally themselves with, or else been willingly absorbed into, the Zarkan ranks. After all, any who resist effectively declare themselves opposed to the will of the Silent King. In such an age of chaos and misrule, there are many Necron nobles who would surrender much to feel the unity and validation of a tyrant's hand upon their shoulder once again, and more who fear the consequences should they refuse. The Sawtek Dynasty. The Sawtek Dynasty has long been the most numerous and aggressively expansionist of all Necron dynasties. Indeed, many of the Necron's foes could be forgiven for their mistaken belief that the colors of the Sawtek Dynasty are in fact the unified military panoply of the Necron race as a whole. It is their legions, after all, that have assailed the lesser races the most often. The crown world of the Sawtek Dynasty is known as Mandragora the Golden, and it is the embodiment of the Sawtek themselves, sepulchrally grim in its macabre magnificence, and fortified on a scale that makes the notion of invasion seem a dark jest. Mandragora is a center for military power, unimaginable riches, and the singular obsession of ultimate galactic conquest. This is but one world of the Sawtek Dynasty, of course. In the centuries since the first Sawtek tomb complexes awoke, this dynasty have claimed hundreds more, though Mandragora is undoubtedly their greatest. The Sawtek legions march tirelessly, the dynasty's entire focus bent upon marshalling ever more armies, raising ever more fleets, and sweeping out through the stars to conquer ever more territories in the name of their Pharaoh, Imhotep, the Stormlord. It is from Imhotep himself that this relentless militaristic bent flows. Formerly a famed nemesis for those he saw as his superiors, Imhotep claimed the throne from those same nobles when they proved unable to set aside their own petty squabbles. From that day onwards, the Stormlord shaped the destiny of his awakening dynasty, focusing their every effort towards unifying the Necrons and ensuring their dominance over the upstart lesser races. The Sawtek dynasty does not restrict its conquests to the worlds of other species. Imhotep's legions have swept over numerous dynastic territories during their relentless expansion. Those who offer ready allegiance are swiftly subsumed into the Sawtek dynasty, often accorded substantial honor for their willingness to accept unity over personal pride. Those dynasties that resist are subjected to the full might of the Sawtek legions, albeit they are usually accorded the dynastic codes of honor. Once humbled, they are absorbed all the same, though in a far more brutal fashion than capitulation would have earned. The results of the unending Sautek conquests are that their legions are immensely numerous and their arsenals replete with mighty war engines. When Emotek stretches out his living metal talons, he can darken the skies with invasion craft, unleash the fire of thousands of massed war engines, and send infantry phalanxes beyond number to crush his foes. While the territory held by the Sautek dynasty does not yet rival that of many lesser races, still it is an immense swath of systems for a few centuries' conquest. If Emotek's advance continues, there's no telling how vast the Sautek Empire may one day become. The Mefrit Dynasty. The Mefrit Dynasty are infamous for their destructive excesses. In the time before the Great Sleep, they were the planetary headsmen of the Silent Kings, employing incredible star-killing weaponry to exterminate entire systems. Once, civilizations all across the galaxy knew to dread the Mefrit Dynasty. When an example needed to be made, or a redoubtable opponent shattered, it was they who executed the deed. Employing spaceborne weaponry of incalculable power, the Mefrit mercilessly slew the stars that gave enemy systems life, leaving their foes frozen in the void or annihilated in seething storms of stellar fire. Many of the other Necron dynasties found such conduct dishonorable and distasteful. Few lauded the Mefrit for their deeds, despite the fact that countless interstellar campaigns were swiftly and decisively concluded in this way. Their peers might have scorned their methods, but none would have been foolish enough to court the Mefrit dynasty's displeasure. In the end, the Mefrit themselves were satisfied that to be feared was an even greater boon than to be accorded honor and respect. The millennia have not been kind to the Mefrit dynasty. Though many of their tomb worlds survive intact, the dynasty's Pharaon, Kyrek the Eternal, was slain by pernicious Eldari infiltrators while he still slumbered. Worse still, the Mefrit have awoken to find their grand weapons of solar execution lost or destroyed by the violent caprice of an uncaring galaxy. Rule of the Mefrit dynasty is now hotly contended for. Ambitious nobles, such as Zarathustra the Ineffable, Eknathet the Glorious, and Anubatar of the Thousand Victories, strive to outmaneuver one another, proving their supremacy through military victories and deeds of grandeur. In truth, though, the first to reclaim the ability to murder stars will surely reign supreme. It is for this reason that several contenders have now turned to the Technomandrites for aid. The Nephrek dynasty. The trinary stars of the Nephrek crown world, Orient, provide an overwhelming bounty of solar energy that has benefited this dynasty greatly. In a galaxy of constant war, however, they have been forced to fight in order to keep what is theirs. When the tomb complexes deep beneath the surface of Arian stirred to wakefulness, its inhabitants emerged to find that the legions of the Altamore dynasty had laid claim to their world. These rivals had been drawn in part by the desire to enslave the imperial settlers who had long basked in Arian solar power. However, the Altamore also sought to harness the energies of these trinary stars for their own military use. The Nephrek Pharaon, Silfek, wasted no time in fighting back. The Great Sleep had corrupted Silfek's personality engrams and left him not just appreciative of his crown world's neighboring stars, but completely obsessed by them. He was incensed by what he saw as the desecration of his dynasty's sacred rites. The campaign for retribution that Silfek led was lightning swift and ferocious, soon driving Altmore necrons and imperial forces alike from the system. Since that day, the Nephrek have basked in the light of their stars. Harnessing these energies has allowed them to amass arsenals of doomsday weaponry and other potent technologies with which to blast their foes to ashes. Silfek's obsessions have also played their part, for his desire to be draped in the molten glory of his stars led his dynasty's cryptex to fashion him living skin of meta-gold that, through advanced hyperalchemical processes, allows him to transform into pure light and cross incredible distances in an eye blink. Believing himself a celestial deity, Silfek has since bestowed this golden form upon his most trusted overlords and other lieutenants, and has even had the technology worked into the burnished bodies of his lesser soldiery. Now, the grand legions of the Nephrek dynasty advance in gilded magnificence, stuttering and blinking across the battlefield with terrifying speed. The Nihilak dynasty. The Nihilak dynasty have garnered a fearsome reputation amongst the galaxy's younger races since their worlds began to awaken. Though often steady and defensive, they are nonetheless ruthless conquerors and deadly foes. As they began to rise from their great sleep, the Nihilak discovered that much of their ancient territory had been invaded. Faced with the very real danger of being overrun, their surviving nobility consolidated the dynasty's strength upon their crown world of Gaiden. This proved a wise move indeed. The Nihilak had always been a tremendously rich dynasty and had funneled much of their vast resource wealth into Gaiden's hyperspatial vaults. Now, they drew upon their hoard to fashion legion upon legion of war engines, raise mighty defenses, and equip their warriors with the finest weaponry imaginable. The lesser races hurled their armies
against the newly fortified borders of the Neolach dynasty, and were rebuffed with devastating casualties. Moreover, once attacked, the arrogant and imperious Neolach nobles would not rest until the perceived impudence of the attackers had been punished with utter annihilation. The well-appointed Neolach legions had another advantage in this war for survival. Greatest of the dynasty's cosmic treasures was the preserved head of the Yethsir, the last of its race, and a means by which the necrons could peer into the schemes of the future. Armed with such prescient intelligence, the Neolach struck precisely where and when they needed to in order to crush any interlopers, transforming their defensive stance into a more offensive march of conquest. Now, the Neolach legions are on the march, seizing and heavily fortifying new territories with noctilith pylons before advancing again. They have openly aligned themselves with the returned Silent King and seek nothing short of galactic dominance for their people. The Novok dynasty. Before biotransference, the Novok dynasty was infamous for its long and elaborate blood rituals, and for the naked savagery of its armies. Though unrecognizable as those hosts from prehistory, their legions retain this bloodlust. Few Necron legions are as frightening to face in battle as those of the Novok dynasty. It is one thing to witness flesh and blood warriors slashing a path through their foes, but to see glassy-eyed androids move from methodical, mechanical killing to ever more frenzied industrial slaughter is another scale of horror entirely. The Novok offer no quarter, no mercy for their victims. Instead, they hack them apart like lunatic butchers set loose in a pen of livestock. They do not stop killing until their living metal bodies are drenched in gore and their victims are naught but dismembered meat. The reason for this gruesome spectacle is that the memories of their dynasty's blood rituals still linger in the personality engrams of the Novok Necrons. Though they can be ponderous, almost somnolent before battle's commencement, once their enemy's blood starts to flow, those engrams are triggered. They provide the Novok soldiery with surges of vigor and aggression that prove near narcotic, while enlivening the blood-spattered Necrons to an ever more dangerous degree. Taking full advantage of this trait, the Novok nobility field vast numbers of infantry assets headed by bands of blade-wielding Lichguard. These they augment, many would say recklessly, with those of their dynasty who have fallen to the destroyer curse. Such a force possesses numbers and resilience, yet its true might is revealed once its Gestalt bloodlust awakens, the butchery begins. Employing these tactics, the Novok Pharaon
Galmok the Moon Killer, has driven his legions relentlessly outwards from his crown world of Dal 6 in one gory conquest after another. They have crushed greenskins and humans alike and show no signs of slowing. Myriad dynasties. The shifting void rifts of the Hiraki deeps hide the core worlds of the Thocht dynasty, which orbit the massive crown world of Megoshta in a stately dance across the eons. Smaller, heavily weaponized planetoids orbit them in turn, wreathed in sparking cerulean energy. The crystalline continent tombs of the Thocht dynasty feed upon the radioactive power of the void rifts that surround them. The sky overhead thick with rippling darkness and flickering blue comets. As their armies emerge from their stasis crypts and march to war, dull metal skulls reflect the cold sapphire stars far above. Though far from the largest or most prolific, the Thocht dynasty is arguably one of the most dangerous upon the field of battle due to its lethal and insidious weaponry. Harnessing the potent radiation in which its worlds bask, the Thocht cryptechs have incorporated rad receptors into the weaponry of their soldiers. This advancement gives its legions an eerie aspect, causing a shimmering azure glow to radiate from them in waves. It is far more than an aesthetic modification, of course. The multispectral radiation that rolls off the metallic bodies of their soldiery is debilitating in the extreme to their foes. The icy lethality of the Hiraki deeps leave the foe weakened and in agony, easy prey for the merciless legions of the Thocht. The Nekthist dynasty have always been synonymous with dubious and dishonorable conduct. Rarely did they adhere to the dynastic codes, for they sought always to employ the most expedient route to victory, even if that came by duplicity, misinformation, or assassination. So disenchanted did the Triarch become with the conduct of the Nekthist that during the reign of Pharaon Oblis the Enslaver, they denied the dynasty aid when its crown world of Mobius came under ferocious orc attack. The devastation wrought by the greenskins was terrible, but not total. Though they lost much, the Nekthist dynasty survived as a jaded and hateful presence. They replaced their former magnificence with harsh, blackened copper carapaces and turned their backs upon the wider Necron race. They now employ any means necessary to protect their domains, no matter how ruthless or contemptible, and spit readily upon the so-called Great Dream of galactic Necron rule. The Ogdebek dynasty, in comparison, benefited greatly from their own rather deviant practices. An unusual pact believed to have been forged shortly after biotransference, saw the nobility and cryptechs of this dynasty accorded equal status. Ogdebek armies were occasionally even led by conclaves of cryptechs, and were always well served by efficient canoptic swarms and magnificent war engines. Over time, however, the cryptechs of the Ogdebek dynasty became arrogant, while their pharaoh, Anathrosis of the Black Star, became ever more paranoid that his upstart viziers would one day try to take power for themselves. As the Great Sleep approached, Anathrosis insisted upon veritable armies of canoptic constructs, slaved to his will alone, that could restore his legion swiftly to glory should they be compromised. He saw to it that his tomb complexes were built with triple-layered backup systems, each element built by rival cryptech conclaves, guaranteed not to collude, and again exclusively bound to Anathrosis' command. All this additional security proved to be of immense value during the Great Sleep. When the dynasties awoke, the vehicles, constructs, and warriors of the Ogdebek emerged from their tombs all but intact. Though its leader remains paranoid and its cryptechs are still troublesome, the dynasty has conquered great swaths of territory ever since. So many fragmented or comparatively minor dynasties are there that even the returned Silent King does not know of them all. Some, though, are infamous amongst the necrons, either for their methods or their turbulent histories. The Charnovok dynasty, for example, were ravaged by the coming of the Tyranid hive fleets, and now cling defiantly to the edges of the eastern fringe. Though they have lost much, this means that only their strongest and most determined nobles and legions have survived. Setting aside any notion of politicking, the elite armies of the Charnovok now fight with cold fury to reclaim what they have lost. Needless to say, they have proven willing subjects for Zarek since his return, for they know that ultimately he alone recognizes the dire threat that the Tyranids represent. The Oruskar dynasty, by comparison, possesses plentiful military power. They are cautious and defensive, however, for they guard a treasure of inestimable power and must be ever ready to defend it. Deep beneath the surface of their crown world, Thanatos, lies the celestial orrery, a perfect replica of the entire living galaxy wrought in precious metals, shimmering energy, and irreplaceable cosmic technology. As the galaxy changes, so the orrery shifts in real time to reflect this, and hundreds of Oruskar technoseers study its every nuance to inform the movements of their legions. More amazing and terrifying still is that with the greatest care and precision, the orrery can be used to affect the galaxy in turn, even fashioning black holes
or snuffing out stars. Fortunately, for the younger races, the Oruskar see themselves as celestial custodians, rarely employing their power unless in greatest need. Others are less cautious, however. The Oruskar's Pharaon, Hakmefet, currently lies besieged by the xenocidal legions of the Cardeneth dynasty, who wish to unleash the full destructive potential of the orrery and remain obstinately blind to the ghastly consequences for reality itself should they succeed. The might of the skeletal necrons is not limited to conventional dynastic legions alone. Bitter outsiders, resentful exiles, and malevolent aberrations abound in the wake of the Great Sleep, and many have fashioned necron armies of their own. Thassar the Invincible, for example, has proven a perilous foe to all who stand before him. After his awakening, the self-styled and highly eccentric pirate king seized the tomb world of Zepenik. Having manipulated the world's master program into making him Pharaon, Thassar remade Zepenik into the Reeve world, building a mighty fleet from drifting wrecks and beginning a campaign of terror against the lesser races. Then there are the haunted legions of Sarkon, crown world of the Empire of the Severed. Long have the Necrons dreaded this awful region, for here catastrophic radiation storms created a dynasty's worth of isolated worlds. As though such a thing were not bad enough, however, now there are reports of Necron armies issuing from this region in great number. Ethereal after-images are said to dance about their bodies, and they move with such eerie synchronicity that they seem driven by a single godlike will. As yet, reports of these legions falling upon outlying fringe worlds, and by some supernatural process, rendering them severed, remain unsubstantiated. If true, however, then the haunted legions represent a terrifying threat to what remains of the Necrons' collective souls. The threat of the Destroyer legions, meanwhile, is clear. None can say whether it is a natural degradation or some strange side effect of the Great Rift's opening, but the madness of the Destroyer cult spreads faster through Necron society than ever before. Nobles turn to nihilistic slaughter in alarming numbers, and in a few rare cases, the entire upper echelons of tomb worlds have dedicated themselves and their servile legions to this morbid cause. With the more unscrupulous cryptex helping to fashion new varieties of destroyer all the time, and ghoulish flayed ones flocking to the bloodshed they create. These legions of the lost and the insane carve bloody paths across the galaxy. The Necrons are a visual dichotomy. Their dynasties hold fast to eons-old martial traditions and highly regimented heraldic schemes. Yet time and entropy combine to render the grandeur of their legions faded and ghoulish. Moreover, the further inclusion of ghastly beings such as the destroyer cults and flayed ones, corrupts the magnificence of the spectacle. Necron armies are thus both darkly majestic and menacingly horrific. The color schemes and heraldic glyphs displayed by the legions of the Necron dynasties are rooted in a time before biotransference. Once, the nobility of the flesh and blood Necron tier would have sent their soldiery to war bearing these markings upon their armor and fluttering banners. Some even had them scarified into their troops' skins. The legions were extensions of their master's power, very much possessions of those who ruled them, and it was only right and proper that the lords of the dynasties marked their chattel as such. When their soldiery were transformed into servile androids, the Necron nobility took to applying their dynastic colors and glyphs directly onto the warriors' metallic bodies. The Necrons' artificial forms are highly receptive to such decorations. Employing the arts of the cryptex, the hues of armor plates can be altered on a molecular level, and the frequencies of weapon crystals, arcane power sources, and the like can be attuned to glow with the same fierce dynastic colors. Equally, glyphs can be picked out in radioactive isotopes or crackling energy channels that would scorch away the flesh of living beings, but which blaze proudly upon the Necron soldiery amidst the smoke and shadow of battle. The glyphs themselves are the primary way in which the varying ranks within the dynastic legion are conveyed, and every dynasty has its own. This sigil conveys to the Necrons everything that dynasty stands for and embodies. It is displayed in various forms across all the war engines, warriors, and nobility of that dynasty, with only the ruling elite being permitted to bear the glyph in its entirety. With each step down the Necron's rigid hierarchy of society and sentience, the dynastic glyph is rendered more basic, or has sections omitted so that the lowly soldiery wear only enough of the glyph for it to be recognizable as their dynasty's own. There is another glyph that appears throughout the armies of the Necrons, regardless of dynasty or alignment. The Ankh of the Triarch is the Necron's omnipresent racial motif. To some nobles, it has long been a symbol of faded glory and a traditional affectation. To others, it is a mark of faith and fealty to the rulers of the lost Necron Empire. With the open return of Zarek the Silent King, the formation of his new Triarch, it seems that the latter camp have been vindicated in their abiding, if somewhat hidebound, faith.